I'd like to welcome everyone to this session sponsored by the Samnon School at Georgia Tech to discuss U.S. alliance leadership after Afghanistan and AUKUS, the Australia, U.S. and U.K. agreement. And the title we gave this was Troubled Waters or Summer Squalls. I'm very, very pleased to have some wonderful speakers to provide different perspectives on this topic with us today. The first is Bruno Tertrais, who is Deputy Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche, Stratégique in Paris. Sorry about my accent. The second is Claudia Major, who is Head of International Security Division in the Stiftung, Wissenschaff and Politik in Berlin. And then we also have Robert Bell, who's a distinguished professor of practice at Georgia Tech and former senior civilian representative of the Secretary of Defense at NATO. And I'm Michèle Flournoy with you. I'm also a distinguished professor of practice at Georgia Tech and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So if you recall, the Biden administration came into office really trying to sort of reset the tone, tenor, and substance of U.S. relationships with its allies and partners. They've had as a founding premise that the United States can't lead effectively without our allies and partners shoulder by shoulder, sort of in aligned with us, working with us to address the challenges we face, whether it's climate change, whether it's a rising China, whether it's deterring Russian misbehavior in Europe, that allies and partners are absolutely key. And I think given the very different approach that the previous administration took to this issue, many had very high expectations for the Biden administration starting off. And they seem to really start off quite strongly in terms of deepening consultations with allies, particularly our traditional allies in NATO and Europe more broadly, and really putting some money in the relationship bank, if you will. But there were a couple of things that happened in the spring and summer timeframe. The withdrawal from Afghanistan and the announcement of the AUKUS agreement that certainly created at least the perception of some messiness or some tensions in our key alliance relationships. So in this event today, we really want to explore whether we think there was some serious disruption or damage done, whether we think this was just a bit of a bump in the road and it's all systems go, we're moving ahead. And so we asked two of our great colleagues from Europe, Bruno and Claudia, to join us to give us their views, but also to have Bob Bell provide his views as both an American commentator and expert in his own right, but also a very keen observer of Europe and transatlantic relations. So what I'd like to do is invite first Bruno and then Claudia and Bob to each offer some opening remarks about how they see the state of our alliances at this point. And then we'll get into a Q&A section that I will moderate, and then we will turn to your questions at the last part of this session. To put in a question, please use the Q&A function, type in your question, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. So with that as an introduction, let me turn it over to Bruno to set the stage with some opening remarks.
Oh, thank you very much, Michèle. It's actually a pleasure and an honor to be with you as a moderator, Bob and Claudia as panelists. When I saw the title of the panel you asked us to speak on, I thought, alliance leadership, what does it mean? And what came to mind is three things, three prerequisites or conditions for alliance leadership. One is clarity of purpose, the other is mutual trust, and the third is ability to build consensus. We can, of course, discuss how much weight each of these components should have, and whether I'm missing something. And I'm happy to discuss it afterwards, but this is what came to mind. Clarity of purpose, well, that's one thing which I think one should applaud the Biden administration for, because it has restored a clarity of purpose in American alliances, and it's about China, China, and China. And that appears to be a very clear strategic direction. We as Europeans friends and allies, we may like it or dislike it, but at least we cannot say that there is at least we have the benefit of clarity. And from someone who I'm afraid is already a seasoned observer of the alliance, I think that it's not every time, all the time, that we've had this clarity of purpose. Another feature of the Biden administration was to restore alliance, and this is where the problem comes, but I'll get to that in a second. Mutual trust, my second component, and this is why AUKUS was so bad for us, for the French-American relationship, and also for our relationship with London and Canberra. This was not about a contract that was not renewed or pursued. This was a breach of trust. This is not about the money, this is about the politics. And I'm sure that many in this audience are familiar with the AUKUS event, but I'd like to emphasize that the reason why it was felt as a real shock and as an earthquake in Paris is that we had the impression that three of our closest allies and friends, Australia is not formally an ally of us, but it's been a very trusted partner over the past 3 years, had negotiated behind our backs something which actually put into question the very basis, the very fundamentals of our strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. So this was not a bump on the road. This was a car crash, literally a car accident. Sometimes we call it the major traffic accident, actually, in Paris. So overall, the French have decided to, let's say, forgive Australia, forgive the US, ignore the UK, and punish Australia, or the other way around. And clearly, the French have given a priority to restore their relationship with the United States, because it's the most important of the three, even more than the French-British one. And because also we know that we have a president in Washington, D.C., in the White House, who can understand the language of transatlantic relations. And the sequence of the past 4 weeks has been very interesting. Clearly, the French and the Americans wanted to rebuild that trust. I think we have reestablished a roadmap. Declarations of love are fine, but proofs of love are better. And I think there is a silver lining in this whole thing, is that there have been very intense French-American defense and security discussions over the past 4 weeks, which I believe can set the stage for a renewed relationship. I'd like to draw your attention in particular to the very long Macron-Biden communique of last week, which was deemed very satisfying by Paris, and I hope it was the same in Washington. For all the talk about strategic independence, something which is dear to the hearts of Americans, but also to the French, and I hope one day also to the Germans, but Claudia might tell us more about that. Our diplomacy is very much dependent on what we do or do not do with the United States. The third component that came to mind when discussing alliance leadership is ability to build consensus. And this has been one of the strengths of the United States in NATO. This has been actually something that only the Americans can do in NATO. And NATO could not work without an American ability to build consensus. And an ability to build consensus means an ability to make compromises. And this is where I think some of the most interesting transatlantic discussions are taking place right now. My impression, I'd like to submit this to the audience and to the other participants, the following, and based on fairly high-level conversations with key American officials over the past 3 weeks. My impression is that because the China challenge is deemed so big, so important, and so and determines pretty much all the rest, there is a feeling in Washington that the United States must be able to willing and able to compromise with Europe on a few important issues, so that they are not, so that they do not create bumps on the road of transatlantic cooperation regarding the Indo-Pacific and China. The Boeing Airbus dispute, for instance, is where there was a settlement recently. The rather muted reaction of the Biden administration on Nord Stream 2 and other issues. I mean, this gives me that the United States, for the sake of the greater good, i.e., to manage China, is on its way to. It has adopted an attitude which is of making compromises so that we can work together on China and the Indo-Pacific. Now, I think we'll probably discuss later on the critical question of how to articulate various allied strategies in the Indo-Pacific, and in particular when looking at China. But this is going to be one of the critical questions, really. Most of the Europeans do not want to bandwagon with the United States in confronting China, but most of them are equally aware and increasingly aware of the importance and the magnitude of the Chinese challenge to the West, and we will be looking for ways together to articulate our various strategies: national, European, American, NATO. And this is it's a process that will take time, but at the same time, we don't have a lot of time because events are pressing us, and the Chinese challenge is increasingly present because of Beijing's actions. And we also need to discuss what this means for deterrence of Russia. Will there be some kind of division of labor? I don't think so. I think formal divisions of labor, the Americans do China and the Europeans do Russia. That it's a figment of the imagination of political scientists. But at the same time, if the US was indeed one day formally involved in a major confrontation in Asia, the Europeans would be called upon to take up a bigger role in deterring and defending against Russia. So these are some of the issues I just talked about are not new. Others are more new, and these are some of the questions that come to mind when looking at the transatlantic landscape these days.
Great. Thank you, Bruno. It's a wonderful setting of the scene. So Claudia, I'd love to hear your views up front.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me, and it's always a pleasure to go on this kind of bilateral formats to hear the various dimensions. A bit like Bruno, I can't give you the German position. I can just give you one German impression, I might say. So not what Berlin is thinking, but what a kind of a German think tanker is thinking about those questions. And I want to give you offer you 3 points. The first in how Germany perceived the Afghanistan withdrawal in the summer. Second, our German position or German impressions on AUKUS, and then what does it say about alliances and US leadership and how we cooperate. Let me start with the first point on Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a deeply disturbing moment from a German point of view, but it was not that surprising, probably. There was a big relief when Biden was elected. It was met with major relief in Germany, because if you look back, traditionally German foreign policy is built on 2 pillars. The first is the transatlantic pillar, cooperation with the US and NATO, and the second pillar is cooperation within Europe, in the European Union, and with France. under Trump, the one pillar, the transatlantic US-NATO pillar, was deeply struggling. So having Biden back saying he values alliances and values transatlantic cooperation was a big relief for Germany. So there was enthusiasm, there was optimism, there was relief, and there was a certain hope. And then the end of the Afghanistan mission came as a major disappointment, and to a certain extent as a shock in several dimensions. There was a deep irritation about the little coordination the US administration was doing. So on the one hand, insisting on the value of allies again, but on the other hand, having the little coordination. And there was also a deep irritation about the seemingly little understanding and taking into account of European positions. So you cannot underline how important allies are, but at the same time not taking into account their priorities or what they think actually. So despite the deep concern that European NATO allies have raised about both the policy and the speed of the withdrawal, there seemed to be no real taking into account, and that was perceived in Germany as really being damaging to NATO. Also, because in view of history, from a German point of view, it's really important to underline that the Afghanistan mission was the follow-up of the first ever invoking Article 5. If you talk about the German armed forces going into operation, being deployed, going somewhere, it's all about Afghanistan. The Afghanistan operation has shaped a whole generation of German armed forces, of politicians, and of civilian civil servants, because Germany always understood that mission as being military and civilian. So you have a whole generation of political, military, and civilian personnel deeply characterized by the Afghanistan mission. So if in Germany we talk about the armed forces, the Bundeswehr being armed forces that are deployed, it's all about Afghanistan. So that really is an element we really need to understand. Afghanistan is the defining moment of the Bundeswehr going out of area and being there for almost 20 years. So there was the impression, and I'm putting that in a little bit provocative way, to say that this deep commitment of 20 years, Article 5, was somehow paid back with a catastrophic endgame, or which was perceived by the German political and military sphere as a really terrible policy choice. So a bit irritating, particularly having in mind this allies count again and America is back, which sounded so differently to Trump. So there was a certain shock and a certain disappointment. There were other lessons to be learned from Afghanistan, which we knew already, which we knew for a long time. The military weakness of the Europeans, their strong dependence upon the US, the little achievement Europe had done since the 1990s, since the Balkan Wars, where Europeans for the first time actually promised to do more on European defense. There was a third lesson, so military weakness, little achievement, third lesson, recognizing that the central focus of the US is now the Indo-Pacific, something we knew, but it was really clearly confirmed. And to a certain extent that Western powers are retrieving from the international scene and that China and Russia is happy to fill the spots that Western countries are leaving. So there were certain lessons, most of them Germany already knew, but the kind of, if I might say, the clarity of that in the Afghanistan case really hurt and was really put question marks on how reliable this alliance is, to what extent allies really count, and to what extent their positions are taken into account. But coupled with the recognition that Europeans are just too weak to make their voice heard, I think the criticism was, to a certain extent, not very loud, because we clearly understood that to a certain extent it was our own fault that we couldn't make a real difference in Afghanistan, we Europeans. So first point, Afghanistan. Second, AUKUS. AUKUS was, as Afghanistan, deeply disturbing, but to a certain extent really unexpected, and that made it so difficult. AUKUS was, in Germany, perceived to a large extent as totally unsettling. We could probably even say a nightmare, because it put Germany in front of many questions, and many unsettling questions that we would love not to address. AUKUS was a way to treat allies like France that is unacceptable. No information, nor consultation about a major political, strategic, and industrial decision. Neither from the US nor from the UK. This is now how we think that. This is not how we think NATO allies should treat each other. From a German point of view, it put us into the difficult position of being obliged to choose somehow between France and the US. I initially mentioned that German foreign policy traditionally is built upon two pillars: US, transatlantic NATO, EU, European Union, Europe, and France. So feeling like being in the middle between the two and being somehow obliged to choose is deeply uncomfortable. We don't want to take sides. There was a certain fear about a French reaction or overreaction, revival of the European strategic autonomy debate, which we hope was somehow calmed down. There was a certain fear that the French Atlanticist would be weakened. So it was a deeply uncomfortable situation from a German point of view. It also confirmed the US focus on China and the Indo-Pacific. And to a certain extent, it raised the fear that Europeans are considered valuable, but not all. So there are allies, like the UK, which are good allies, but other allies, in brackets, the EU allies, might be somehow in a different category of allies. So there was a certain fear that the US didn't give up on Europe, but maybe gave up on the European Union. It also confirmed the difficult role that the UK was playing in European security and defense, because it incarnated the global Britain idea as outlined in the integrated review for March 2000 this year, which also seemed to set the UK on a certain anti-EU path. So that also raised a difficult point for Germany. It confirmed that geopolitics and great power competition is really there, which is a very uncomfortable situation. So there was a certain fear that the US and its European partners are not on the same page geopolitically. So there seems to be a kind of split between maybe this kind of US, UK, and EU when it comes to dealing with Indo-Pacific and China. There's another inquietude or kind of wariness from a German perspective is that the usual frameworks in which Germany likes to act, Germany is very much in favor of institutional frameworks, that those frameworks didn't seem to be that stable and adapted to future challenges. The US having this AUKUS alliances seemed to be a confirmation that the US is multilateralizing alliances, looking for other formats and for new formats, and that the old formats like NATO or the EU are not longer that valued. So from a German point of view, Germany that prefers the European Union and NATO, realizing that those formats are maybe not those formats that matter that much to the US, is deeply unsettling. Also recognizing that those formats, EU and NATO, are not the formats that will play the major role in the Indo-Pacific. So there's a kind of double unsettling with regard to the traditional formats and the region. So there was a question what it means actually for cooperation with the US, with France, with NATO, and with the Brits, which is not a nice position to be in. To a certain extent, it recalled the famous Macron interview in The Economist, where he said NATO was brain dead, recognizing that NATO in the military way is functioning, maybe not perfectly, but pretty well. But in a political way, it doesn't work if allies don't cooperate. And that comes back to the 3 points that Bruno made: trust, purpose, and consensus didn't seem to be on high demand in the case of AUKUS. So AUKUS, in the end, asked 2 key questions. If the US-China systemic competition is a key challenge for the Western world, we need to cooperate and not divide ourselves. So why so openly and brutally offending a key ally, France, in the Indo-Pacific, who in addition is the only, if we are honest, really willing and able other European nation next to the UK to get engaged there? Who is there permanently with 7,000 military personnel, with 3 military bases? So we should rather team up. So really AUKUS should have treated France differently. France succeeded in turning that on a big diplomatic success in the follow-up, but the first impression was really disastrous. The second key question is, was this offense to France deliberate? That would be worrying. Or is it another example of a crisis of competence in the US administration, showing that the US administration is not able to deal with complicated, complex dossiers, Afghanistan being the other example? That would be equally worrying. So was the offense to the EU, who was publishing its Indo-Pacific strategy on the same time like AUKUS was published, was that offense deliberate, collateral damage, or lack of competence? And that brings me to my last brief point. Are these two developments odd one outs, new developments, new pattern? Is this a crisis of competence, or is this a crisis of commitment to European allies? With commitment, I mean that the US is turning away from Europe and having its focus elsewhere. Competence, crisis of competence would mean that the process and structures didn't work properly. And there's a problem, let's say, of craftsmanship, of actually bringing the various positions together, thinking of European allies and bringing the various dimensions of political work together. Probably it's a mix of both, that the second, the crisis of competence, seemed to be real. And that means a certain inability to cope with complex dossiers, Afghanistan, AUKUS, a lack of coordination in the US administration, a lack of sensitivity, what it would mean for European allies, in the case of AUKUS for France. And even if France succeeded in a diplomatic commitment to turn the situation around into French favor with various meetings, with working groups, with the US publicly apologizing for lack of coordination, which I would in all openness say bravo to the French diplomacy, there seems to be a pattern. And that is something that worries, that is worrying because it asks questions about the next complex dossiers that are on the table. And one dossier that many European allies are worried about in the moment is, for example, the nuclear declaratory policy with the next nuclear posture review, and many other military political decisions coming up. So I think the big question we are wondering about is to what is the kind of stronger element, crisis of competence or crisis of commitment. Both are unsettling. And in the combination, probably particularly, and that in the moment where we have a new German government that is in the process of making and would probably need some reassurance also from the American allies. I will stop here.
Thank you, Claudia. So Bob, I'm going to turn over to you to provide a bit of a response to what you've heard so far, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Well, I'm very happy, Michèle, to come in and respond. And in many cases, I think I'll be reinforcing points that Bruno and Claudia have made. In some cases, I'm a little more confident about the administration's ability to get it straight in the long run. But I do agree that it's fair to say that the administration has made a credible, good start in trying to repair the damage done by the two events that we're discussing today. I mean, there's no question that damage was done. As Claudia noted, that President Biden has said that the AUKUS whole episode was handled clumsily and without grace. And to say without grace just after you've met the Pope in the Vatican is a pretty serious statement. Afghanistan, I think the administration's been a little more defensive, trying to highlight the logistical capabilities of our C-17 force, which were quite extraordinary. But even former Secretary of Defense, our old boss, Leon Panetta, Michèle, said yesterday on Fox News that that Biden ought to take responsibility because we botched the end game of the whole Afghanistan experience. So there was a hole that the administration dug that they had to get back out of, or as the Brits would say, these were own goals. These were mistakes of our own doing that were unfortunate. Now, since then, it seems to me there's been a pretty sustained effort to get the ship of state, if you will, sailing straight again. I mean, it all started not only with the president's phone call with President Macron on the 22nd of September, but the concessions, the admissions, the humility that's represented in the joint statement that came out of that call. Biden committing to help France in the Sahel, Biden going out of his way to acknowledge the importance of a stronger EU defense capability, a Biden commitment to in-depth consultations, and an admission that the consultations were inadequate. Here, I'd really like to pick up on a point that Claudia just made about the Macron economist interview of 2 years ago and the famous brain dead statement, which most Americans didn't understand in terms of what the point of the critique was. Of course, the context for that was that Macron had just been shocked that in a phone call with Erdogan, President Trump had told the American forces in Syria to get out of the way so the Turkish army could overrun the allies that we were counting on to defeat ISIS. And this in the middle of a coalition, a global coalition to defeat ISIS in which the French were key partners. So when Macron talked about being brain dead, he meant the absence of strategic consultations, not just a foreign ministerial meeting where the US gives the allies a heads up of what our decision that's already been taken is, but strategically trying to figure out a plan to change course. Now, since that initial phone call, it seems to me there's been progress. I certainly agree with Bruno that the October 29th joint statement, the readout of that meeting in Rome on the margins of the G20, is quite extraordinarily rich with commitments and content and work programs. But I think the key is that the French have made clear that it can't just be words. As Bruno said, there have to be concrete results. And what really struck me about that October 29th joint statement, in addition to many other things that are in there, is that the joint statement says, in effect, that this is still a work in progress. It says that these in-depth consultations, this work program that the two countries are following up on, pursuant to the September 22nd phone call, is aimed at creating the conditions for ensuring trust. In those words, creating the conditions in other venues can be associated with long-term goals, like President Obama trying to direct the creation of conditions to allow a nuclear-free world. Now, I don't think that's what it means in this case, that this is like not in my lifetime, as Obama said, but it does, I think, underscore the point of view from the Élysée Palais that, we're not there yet. We're working through a work program, and we respect that and appreciate the effort that's being made, but don't assume that this gets fixed with just a couple of ministerials or phone calls. But of course, it's been more than that on the world scene since these two blow-ups. You had the G20, you had the Glasgow conference, both of which it seemed to me that President Biden demonstrated competence, Claudia. So I would have some confidence out of those two multilateral engagements that there's a hardcore of competence that can be brought to bear here. But more importantly, I would point to the October NATO Defense Ministerial, which it seems to me was quite a success under the direction of Secretary Austin. NATO approved this new multi-domain concept for defense and deterrence in the European area. It's classified, so nobody knows anything about it, but it's been under development for a couple of years. It's quite far-reaching. It's significant in the sense that it really does try to bring space and cyber and nuclear and conventional all into one sort of central conceptual approach. But perhaps most, in terms of my impressions, was the reaction I got in a track 2 discussion with a number of leading Russian academics about how alarmed they were by the results of the October Defense Ministerial NATO, that this was really putting NATO in a preparatory stage for conflict in Europe. Now, the American participants in that conversation tried to knock this down, But I would just say that if there was no confidence in the competence of American leadership, we wouldn't have gotten all the results that we got out of the October Defense Ministerial. That doesn't mean that we're home free, but it does mean that we're working hard, event by event, to show that we can steer this ship. Now, the other reality, in addition to the fact that this is still a work in progress, is that the devil is in the detail. And it's easy to say that, it's a sort of a trite expression, but in this case, I really do think the devil is in the detail. And let me just give two examples. The October 29th joint statement has a sentence that's gotten a lot of attention, but it's not that extraordinary. It's not that pushing the envelope beyond where we are now, and that's that President Biden committed to a European defense that's stronger and more capable and complementary to NATO. Then the question is always, what is the line between complementarity and duplication? What does that sentence really mean? What will we learn as that sentence gets translated into more granular language as NATO negotiates the strategic concept that it wants to have ready by June? There was a Washington Post report that in Rome, when President Biden met with Italian Prime Minister Draghi, he addressed this issue. And according to the Washington Post, Biden endorsed the idea of that level of ambition for EU defense as including a unified military defense. Now, maybe that's just the reporter's characterization, or maybe it's the unsourced attribution characterization, but does it mean that Biden agreed to an integrated and separate command structure for CSDP missions, the issue that has roiled the waters of American EU CSDP relations for so long? Well, I'm not suggesting anything. I have no idea. My point is just that this will have to be fleshed out over time. And we'll see to what extent Biden sort of pushes the views in Washington that have always been so skeptical of letting CSDP become too capable lest it duplicate NATO, if he pushes it further than past presidents have. And then secondly, in that statement, Biden and Macron committed to initiate a strategic dialogue on defense trade and talked about the administrative arrangement for U.S. participation in PESCO and EDF and other EU-led defense initiatives. And that's going to be interesting to see how that's fleshed out over time. Now, presumably with the Boeing-Airbus fight being put into a timeout for a couple of years, the climate's better to try to address transatlantic defense trade issues. But when you read Biden's domestic job speeches, what you hear quite emphatically is buy America, buy America, buy America. So I think that's going to be a very interesting discussion. Then I'll just close with two other points. One is I completely agree with Claudia that while we may be focused now on sort of the immediate agenda and trying to get everything back in the box, there are new issues that could upset things again and plunge us back into a new set of crises or controversies. And certainly in terms of France, but not just France, also the Baltics, Poland, Romania, to name a few countries, is the issue of where Biden comes out on the nuclear posture review with regard to nuclear first use doctrine or its twin sole purpose concept. And without getting into debate over what's the correct posture to take, I would just note that during the Clinton administration, when I was President Clinton's senior defense director on the NSC, we went to tremendous lengths working hand in glove with the French and the British to agree a P3 statement that was within the Security Council, a tripartite statement on what our nuclear declaratory policy was that was enshrined in the United Nations Security Council resolution. So if Biden chooses to change this, I don't know if he will. He has said he will. That was a campaign pledge. But if he chooses to change it, what is going to be the level of strategic consultation not only with the Baltics and Poland, but with France and the UK on that issue. And to what extent, as Claudia pointed out quite correctly, to what extent will our allies that don't want to change on that issue try to leverage their assertiveness on a China policy? What's going to be the trade-offs between those two issues? And then last but not least, because I don't want to get into domestic politics, but hanging over all of this is what I'll just say is the Trump effect. Although since the Virginia gubernatorial elections of Tuesday, it's clear there are forces in the Republican Party at work that go beyond just what Trump himself brings to the game. But there is this question about permanence, the permanence of American leadership in the current political environment in Washington, and whether deals that are struck at great cost, with great passion, with great effort and treasure, can be relied on for more than just a year or two. I don't have an answer to that, but I do think that that's a factor now in alliance politics when it comes to trust and confidence in American leadership.
Thanks, Bob. So I want to, all of you have talked about the strategic shift to pay more attention to the rise of China and aggressive behaviors, and to the importance of the transatlantic alliance, actually, and allies finding a sense of common purpose and a sense of a consensus around an approach to China that's effective. And yet, when you look at opinion polls and various other indicators, I think that it's fair to say there's a shared sense of concern about China, but not necessarily consensus on strategy. And I for one believe that the bumpiness of both Afghanistan and AUKUS were less deliberate policy efforts on the part of the administration, more stumbles or fumbles. But every crisis is the silver lining is there's some opportunity there. So the question is, how can we come out of this stronger? Because we are having candid discussions about what went right, what went wrong, what do we learn from it, and specifically, how should all of this inform? What do you want to see from the Biden administration in terms of engaging France, Germany, Europe, NATO partners or allies on coming up with a common approach vis-a-vis China and the Indo-Pacific? So, Bruno, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Michelle. Can I just come back for a second before I answer your question on the question of French perception of the Atlantic Alliance today? Without coming back to the infamous October 2019 Macron statement, what I want to emphasize is that Macron does reflect a fairly well-known French narrative, according to which the United States can never be as reliable a partner as it is one. It's always been a distant country with global interests, and two, it's losing interest because of China, losing interest in us because of China, and three, it has enough domestic problems on its plate. So when Macron says NATO runs the risk of being brain dead, it's not only Macron, it's a very deep French narrative against which some of us are fighting, but which is deeply ingrained in France. And when he said brain dead, he was not referring to NATO. He was referring indeed, as Bob hinted at the Atlantic Alliance, and what it means to be an ally, and what expectations you have when you're an ally. And expectations is that you don't get a text message saying, oh, by the way, we're out of Syria. You don't have a President Erdogan which threatens other members of the alliance. And that's the reason why AUKUS was a double whammy in a sense, because it reinforced some of the preconceived ideas that many of us have in France. When I say many of us, that not me, because I think the French narrative the traditional French narrative is unconvincing. However, this also happened in the midst of a pre-presidential campaign. Can you believe that I participated after the AUKUS announcement in a TV debate for which the topic was, should we leave NATO altogether? Not leave the integrated military. Should we leave? What are we still doing in NATO? So, I mean, among the many reasons why AUKUS, I'm sorry to go back to AUKUS, and we need to move forward, but I think it's important to understand on your side of the pond that there were so many reasons why the wound was so deep. And another reason, by the way, is that those of us who've been trying to have France and Europe involved in the Indo-Pacific, we're doing that with the view that we need to work alongside, not necessarily always with, but at least alongside the United States, not against the United States. So it was triple whammy. So I'm sorry to get back to this, but I think it's really important for the audience to understand that the transatlanticists in France were significantly weakened by AUKUS, and a communique will not patch up things rapidly because we are already starting the presidential campaign. So anyway, sorry to focus so much on our own domestic context. I think it's important to understand what can we do to go forward. Let me say that there was a silver lining, not only on the French-American front, but also on the US-EU front, because to its credit, the Biden administration has understood very quickly that having a more serious US-EU dialogue on security issues, having a transatlantic dialogue on the Indo-Pacific was something which was lacking, and that it was in its own interest. So again, as much as I've criticized the Biden administration for the management of Afghanistan and AUKUS, I credit them for having had an ability to turn around and see that that we did something which is not necessarily in our long-term interest, and they had the ability to try to fix it as much as possible. Now, a key question is, what do we want to do with NATO and China? Should NATO stay in its traditional Euro-Atlantic role? No, there's already a consensus, and one which I agree with, that China is too big, China is too global for NATO to not deal with China at all. Problem then comes when you try to, this is what I call the fundamental problem of articulating our various strategies in the Indo-Pacific. NATO, EU, US, France, the UK, Germany, how do we articulate all this? It's a game that's just started, but we need to get our acts together and make decisions as soon as possible. Ideally, it would be in a quad format, the old quad, not the new quad, with the UK, a format that Michèle and Bob know very well. But the problem is that the relation with the UK is so difficult that we won't do it in the quad. But I think it's really the next, preferably before we agree on a strategic concept for NATO, we need to get our acts together and deciding a little more precisely how we want to articulate our various strategies vis-a-vis China. You will never have a completely united Western plus front behind you, but I think that it's a common interest to ensure that that each of the actors, the national and in France, the UK, Germany, the EU, NATO, has its own course in the Indo-Pacific, but while ensuring at the same time that China cannot divide us in ways that it's so good at doing. So it's going to be difficult, but I think it's really one of the most important fields of work for the transatlantic actors in the coming 6 months. I'm saying 6 months. This can't wait 6 years. It should be done in the next 6 months. China will not wait.
So, Claudia, I'd love to get your thoughts on this issue. How does the Biden administration both kind of rebuild trust and consultation, and specifically start to build more of a transatlantic consensus on how to approach China?
I will start with, I will very briefly touch upon two other points and then come to that. What I found, come back to this famous Economist Braindead interview. What is fascinating is that it not only hinted upon the lack of coordination at that time with the Trump administration, but it actually hinted at three problems. And the one was Turkey, second was the US administration under Trump, and the third was the lack of coordination and agreement among the European allies. And the idea was to say, if this alliance works militarily and it works well, that's not enough, because the real brain behind, or the real value and power of that alliance is 30 allies actually being together and convincingly promising to themselves and to the outside world that they will stand up for each other in case of crisis. But if you have an American president like Trump, if you have Turkey, and if you have the Europeans not agreeing on what they really want, this political unity and cohesion is under threat. And that was a very clear statement. Obviously, it was triggered by Syria, but it went beyond. It was about the US, Turkey, and the Europeans. What I found interesting, but that's probably a little bit a kind of Franco-German thing, because Bruno made the difference between NATO and the alliance. That's a really interesting one, because that's a typical French approach to say we have the military aspects and the political aspects. From a German point of view, very briefly, NATO is our life insurance, full stop. So we don't make that difference so clearly as Bruno made it. For us, transatlantic relations, insecure and defense is NATO, full stop, 100%. We don't conceive many things outside NATO, and that makes it for us Germans so difficult to think in terms of AUKUS, Quad, Five Eyes, or whatever changing alliances. So if you look to things like AUKUS, that seems to be the future of alliances: agile, changing, small, complementary, interblocking to a certain extent, changing again. So that's really an important thing to keep in mind, that for us, NATO is central, and for France, transatlantic cooperation can take place outside NATO, in the Sahel, in other formats. For Germany, NATO is really the central format, and that's really an important thing to understand.
Claudia, can I just step in on that point with you? Because I think one of the foundational assumptions for those most American policymakers who are working in Asia is that, a NATO type format doesn't work in Asia. You have to come up with a more informal set of partnership formats. And so the Quad, operationalizing the Quad is one idea. AUKUS as a more security defense focused, arrangement. But it's precisely because NATO is not possible, and a NATO-like organization is not possible in Asia. But I don't think, I think it's an unintended consequence for the innovation in those more flexible formats to cause people to lose confidence in NATO, or question the U.S. commitment to NATO. I think the commitment to, and I understand in light of recent events, I understand why these discussions are happening. But we've got to find a way as allies where the innovation that's required to organize ourselves to deal with challenges in Asia, aren't perceived as a fundamental threat to the vitality of NATO.
I think this is understood, but it still remains unsettling. So there is reflection about why could not Germany join a British carrier group? Why could not Germany do something together with the French? I mean, Germany is increasing its commitment in the region. It sent a frigate. Okay, it's only a frigate, but for German, in the kind of German framework, sending a frigate to the Indo-Pacific was quite a commitment. The German Air Force is sending planes, I think this year or next year. So there is a stronger commitment, but it still is something that is quite a challenge in the German way of doing things, if I might say so. I totally understand your point. And Germany is not calling for NATO being the central framework in the Indo-Pacific, not at all. I think it's recognizing that it will be smaller, more flexible, variable formats. But while it's recognizing these this kind of new settings, it still remains difficult to kind of find its way and find its place in it. And I think this is something we need to recognize, that this also due to the limited resources. I mean, Germany is a big country in the middle of Europe, but if you look at the state of its navy, there's a certain limit, a very practical limit, actually, to be present in the region. A very brief point on AUKUS again. I think what is really, to put it very clearly, you can say AUKUS were two NATO allies stabbing a third NATO allies in the back. This is how it can be read. You don't have to read it that way, but the first reading that was made in Europe was two NATO allies, the UK and the US, did something behind the back of a third NATO ally, France. And that is not the way to do things. And it really underlined, Bruno hinted at that, the very difficult UK-EU relationship. So again, AUKUS was launched the day the EU was launching its Indo-Pacific strategy. You can do it. It's probably not very elegant. So it underlines the extremely difficult relationship that the EU is having with the UK in the moment, and which is not likely to change. If I look to the expectations, or what we expect from the Biden administration, I think real coordination rather than information is something that would certainly be very high on the list. A real interest in European defense and a real acceptance of European defense efforts. There are really good signs, like the agreement on PESCO, like the participation in EU Council formats. But in the past, we had this kind of Europeans have to do more, which I totally agree, but not in the EU. So there was a kind of contradiction in saying you have to do more, but we tell you the way you have to do more. And to kind of overcoming that tension is underway. If you look at PESCO, the probably agreement with the European Defence Agency, as I said, the participation in EU Council meetings, which have a high symbolic way. But I think there's still something to do. And as Bruno said, a vision on China that is not only based on competition or how I put it, that is maybe a bit more complex from a European or from a German point of view than pure containment or confrontation. That's a bit broad, but I think the biggest worry in Germany is what I mentioned initially under the word of life insurance. Germany considers the US in NATO as the life insurance, largely based on nuclear deterrence in Europe. So any change in the political, military, conventional, or nuclear posture is perceived as less life insurance.
Thank you. So Bob, I want to bring you in on this question of, the next possible chapter for deep consultations across the Atlantic with NATO. The United States is in the midst of a nuclear posture review. There are, my understanding is that they're kind of all issues are on the table. Nothing is off the table. And in light of what we've experienced and in light of the need to kind of rebuild trust and strength of consultations and keep the importance of NATO front and center, how would you advise, what advice would you give to the Biden administration on how they should approach consultations about the nuclear posture review and nuclear policy broadly in NATO as the NPR is done on the US side and the new strategic concept is being worked in Brussels?
That's important to recall that the same sort of question was posed at the end of the Obama administration. And President Biden, then Vice President Biden, could not have been more clear or transparent in laying out sort of where the thinking was than he was in the speech that he gave at the Brookings Institute. I think it was January 12th or maybe the 17th, a week or 10 days before President Trump was inaugurated. And he said quite candidly that he and President Obama had come to the conclusion that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons was to deter an adversary's use of nuclear weapons. And he went beyond that and said, if you try to look at a scenario where NATO would use, or US would use nuclear weapons first, it makes no sense. Those were Vice President Biden's words. Then, as a presidential candidate, of course, you always had to answer all these questionnaires from all sorts of parts of your constituency. And President Biden was very clear in committing to the NGO arms control constituency of the Democratic Party that if he was elected president, he would act on that set of beliefs. So he faces a very difficult choice here in the sense that he's being held to this commitment by the Democratic base, if you will. There's a lot of angst and alarm within that constituency now. You see press articles increasingly and op-eds being written one way or the other on this issue about where the nuclear posture review is going to come out in January. Is President Biden going to direct the U.S. to adopt a no first use policy, a sole use policy, or no change? At the same time, as happened in late 2016 and 2017, it quickly became evident that NATO, and particularly the French and the British, the Baltics, Poland, and the national security establishment, if you will, in Washington, the Pentagon, most of the State Department, the National Security Council, all were advising President Obama of what the cost would be of making that change in terms of a loss of confidence and credibility of extended deterrence and Article 5 in NATO, and not just in NATO, in Indo-Pacific as well. So in the speech in the Brookings Institution, Biden said, in effect, but we're leaving office in a week, so we will leave it to Mr. Trump to decide. And the Trump administration repudiated the whole thing decisively. So, but now that bill is coming due. And President Biden has to weigh, on the one hand, the credibility of his campaign commitment to a key part of his constituency and his own beliefs and President Obama's beliefs in reducing the role that nuclear weapons play in deterrence policy, which they believe quite sincerely, on the one hand, and what he is being told in terms of what the repercussions are going to be if he actually tries to adopt it. What I would hope is that he would announce that it is his personal belief and he is committed personally to try to find some way to get there, but that in the current situation, Russia and its, as you said, Michelle, misbehavior in Europe, the buildup on the Ukrainian border, the projection of Chinese nuclear forces going to 1,000, for a lot of reasons, he thinks this requires more study. That would be sort of a classic punt, if you will, to buy time. But what I suspect is going to happen is someone is going to be tasked to write an extremely artful sentence that says, we are going to declare, as far as we're concerned, that it's the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter use, but there's no change in our policy at NATO. In effect, that's what happened on Taiwan when President Biden said, yes, of course we're committed to defending Taiwan, and then the White House spent a week saying there'd been no change in our policy. Whether that would be sustainable within EVER discussions at NATO headquarters, I don't know. I would hope, as I said earlier, that there will be genuine strategic consultations on this because it fundamentally engages French and British nuclear equities, not to mention the whole nuclear sharing arrangement in NATO and the reliance of so many of our allies on that, however remote and difficult to imagine scenario of a U.S. first use with the dual capable aircraft posture. That's still, in terms of the summit statement that came out of Brussels just 3 months ago, said that NATO nuclear deterrence relies on that posture. And that posture arguably relies on a presumption that it would be used first, since it couldn't survive a first strike and be used second.
Thank you, Bob. So, Bruno, I just want to give you a chance to briefly comment on the scenario that Bob paints, because France, obviously, these issues are near and dear to France, and you all are very strong voices on these NATO, but also Claudia. I mean, Germany post, once the government is formed, one of the things that'll be on the table is what does Germany do about modernizing its dual-capable aircraft, and how does it go forward with its role in the NATO nuclear burden sharing? So I'd like to get you each briefly to comment on that, and then we're going to turn to some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Michelle. Glad to do that. First of all, I respect President Biden's commitment on his fundamental beliefs on these matters. He's thought about these issues for 50 years, been very consistent for the past 6 years about this, so this has to be respected. Second, I don't think the United States can square the circle of reassuring allies, strengthening its commitments, and shift to a sole purpose statement. So that very carefully crafted sentence that Bob Bell just suggested, I think it doesn't work. Deterrence, we all know that is all about perceptions. And even if, the United States ensures its allies in Europe and in Asia that, well, changing the language would rest assured that nothing's changed. And I'm not sure the parallel with Taiwan is actually correct. I think this will have effects that will be contradictory to the overarching administration's goals, which is to strengthen and rejuvenate alliances. Second point very quickly, the P3 consultations, my understanding is that they are not as intense as they were during the Obama administration. And I don't believe, but Bob, I was not physically present, I don't think they are as good as they were so far, as they were during the Clinton administration. That's my understanding. I hope it gets better. I'm always passing the message to my American friends, look, the best way to make sure that you build consensus is precisely to have timely consultations at a time where you have not yet made all your decisions. Three, and finally, I don't think this is going to happen. My hunch has always been from the beginning, the United States will end up having some language a la Nuclear Posture Review 2010. I don't think, so it'll give the impression, actually it will be moving backwards in a good way, so to say, but not go as far as declaring a sole purpose posture. If it did, however, it would once again, it would reinforce the French and not only French narrative, according to which over the past 10 years, the US is, even less, that's the French speak, even less reliable as it was in the past. So that would reinforce that narrative. So I understand the equation is impossible for the Biden administration. And I'd love to know what will go on in the U.S. president's mind when we have to try to square the Rubik's Cube problem. But that's the reason why you get elected president, to solve impossible problems. By the way, Michelle, there are good questions on the Q&A, so yes. I hope we'll get a chance to briefly address them later on.
Yes. So, Claudia, anything on this issue before we turn to the Q&A?
Yes, I think I agree with Bruno. Squaring the circle it's very difficult or not going to work. So you could think in terms of two scenarios: to have a purely declaratory policy change, but nothing else, or you have a declaratory policy change with also a posture change if you are really serious. I think the key problem is that the challenges from Russia to China will not believe any declaratory policy change anyway, but the allies will believe it. And then we come to that what Bruno just outlined. This will reinforce the narrative in Europe, like, can we really trust the Americans? Are they really still there? And from a German point of view, there's a certain fear that then the French come up again with their proposal on a nuclear dialogue, which makes us Germans feel uncomfortable because we like to have the nuclear deterrence issue in NATO. So however you turn that topic around, it's not nice. Not something we would love to discuss. the other point that is made to a certain extent in Europe or in Germany is to say, what is a security environment change that would justify such a policy change? Because if this is what you mentioned earlier, if you look at China, if you look at Russia, you might rather go down the British road, like in the integrated review, and increase the role of your nuclear weapons. Not something that Germany would do. But the question is, has something become so much better, like under Obama, that you could say, hey, let's reduce the role of nuclear weapons? And this is, I think, where the kind of the work to explain to the Europeans the kind of security policy environment change that would make it happen is difficult. Last point, why it's so difficult? Because in Germany, in the moment, we are negotiating the new coalition. And one of the topics that is difficult to discuss is a nuclear basket. And in the nuclear basket, you have the topic of the nuclear sharing arrangements, with the question whether Germany is going to keep its role, whether it's going to change its role, and how will Germany assure that it's technically capable to contribute to the nuclear sharing. We have very aging, very old DCA aircraft, dual capable aircraft, the Tornado, which needs to be replaced to assure that Germany is still technically capable to actually contribute planes and pilots to the nuclear sharing arrangements. There's quite disagreement in the current coalition talks whether Germany should keep its role in nuclear sharing as it has at the moment. And the second nuclear topic that is discussed in a quite controversial way is the ban treaty, the treaty banning nuclear weapons, and whether it would not be an interesting idea for Germany to join that treaty in an observer status. So the nuclear question is actually coming back. And if you put those two kind of questions together, on the one hand, you have the US who is thinking about adopting a no first use or sole purpose approach, which would, in order to limit the role of nuclear weapons in its strategy. From a German point of view, you could easily ask if even the Americans want to reduce that role. Shouldn't we also reduce our role in nuclear deterrence? Why should we then stay in the nuclear sharing arrangements? Procure a dual capable aircraft, which is highly controversial in Germany, if even our biggest ally is not sure whether it's the right way. And if you think about nuclear deterrence in Europe being built on three pillars, US strategic weapons, nuclear sharing arrangements where Germany contributes, and the independent contribution of the UK and France, we have currently two pillars, the US pillar and the nuclear sharing pillar, which is more or less seriously, but to a certain extent indeed, questioned. And that's not good news neither for the alliance nor for the kind of transatlantic alliance nor the European allies. So I think consultations, coordination, listening to each other consciously is extremely important to avoid any decisions that would probably be regretted later on, to put it in that way.
Thank you. So I do want to get to some audience Q&A. So Byron, I think it's Stokesk, has asked about, he's focused on the question about, can we find some cooperative areas to open dialogue? So he says, what about environmental diplomacy? Could this be a way to open dialogue with the US, France, Germany, China, maybe even Russia? You know, this is a major national security issue. Climate is a national security issue that affects all of us. You know, should we be paying more attention to, you know, building cooperation in an area like climate? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Well, I mean, I can jump in, but I'm sorry to say that, well, first of all, I'm not sure that it's obviously a major national security issue, but we can debate at length whether it's a major one. However, the simple answer to that is that at this point in time, I don't see neither Moscow or Beijing being really discussing this. When they want to discuss it, it's for Russia to say, okay, the northern maritime route is ours and entirely ours. That's the way they discuss environmental security. But there were some other questions earlier. Would you like us to, given that in the interest of time, should we address some of them? I'm happy to briefly touch upon a couple of them. What do you say, Michèle? I can't hear you.
Sorry, if you
Yes.
want to pick out one or two that you'd like to respond to, that's great.
Yeah, well, the first question was, do we need AUKUS since we have the Quad? And the simple answer is that they serve very different purposes, and AUKUS have nothing to do with the Quad. Do current U.S. domestic issues further erode the trust of France and Germany and the EU? I would say that a French answer to that was that, well, they should. It should. That's what the French have been saying all along, a bit too loudly to my taste. But I think the answer of the French would be they should. And likewise, for the question, why didn't the US distractions from Afghanistan begin in 2003? Cause our European allies to be more prepared for a capricious end to the US presence there. Yeah, well, okay. Short answer to that is that when the French started the conversations on withdrawing from Kabul in April of this year, almost all of them, almost all of our European allies said, you're crazy, that's not going to happen. Said, yes, we should get ready in case it happens. And the very simple answer, except for one European ally, all of our other European allies were saying, nah, come on. So I'm critical enough of the French policies on in many instances that I can say that on this particular point, the French were right. And yes, we should have prepared better collectively for that possibility. It didn't happen. And very quickly on the French-British or British-European no, there is no movement to reconcile the UK-Europe fracture. And I'm sorry to say that I'm laying the blame squarely. I'm sorry that there is no breed to give an opposite viewpoint, squarely on London. London is not interested. I'm leaving aside the French-British dimension. But Europe, EU, UK, I don't know what Claudia thinks, but I don't think that the UK at this point in time is interested. Claudia, do you have a different view?
No, I totally agree. I think if you look at the EU-UK relationship, the UK consciously decided to take foreign security and defense policy out of any agreement. So they consciously went into this no agreement thing. And there was a strong willingness. The European countries, particularly Germany and France, certainly prefer an agreement between the EU and the UK to bilateralism. And in the moment, this is simply an institutionalized cooperation, and the moment is not possible. So to a certain extent, we have a kind of short-term relationship and a long-term potential relationship. The short-term relationship is there will be no institutional cooperation. It will be built on ad hocism, on small informal formats, and NATO. So you will have the E3 working if it works. You will have NATO, and you will have, to a certain extent, small bilateral relationships. There was a German-British agreement signed last summer, and the UK is very much into reviving the bilateral relationship. In the same time, there's a clear position from most of the EU states who say EU first. And this is something that my impression is in London has not always been well understood, that there is a conviction, at least in Berlin, that there should be an institutionalized cooperation between the EU and the UK. And if this goes well, also the bilateral relationship will flourish even more. Given that with the current government, this institutionalized cooperation is not possible, so we will have ad hocism, small formats, and NATO. If you get a policy change, a political change, a government change in the UK with the next general election, that might change. We might engage in negotiations about an institutionalized cooperation. As it looks now in the UK, I'm not sure we will get the change of government. So that kind of hibernation might take even longer. We have several kind of in-between steps that could be taken. I mentioned earlier that the US foreign minister participated in EU Council meetings. This is something you could do with high symbolism and which doesn't cost you much, which you don't give up sovereignty on that if you do this. But even those tiny steps are in the moment not acceptable for the UK. So I think we have to a certain extent recognize that it will remain difficult. AUKUS has shown it remains difficult. There's no willingness like the US has shown to participate for example, in PESCO or the European Defence Agency. So it will remain ad hoc, difficult in the short term, and there might be a better perspective in the long term. But here I'm always Bruno on this being really a difficult one. If you look in the integrated review, the European Union doesn't seem to exist, which is quite amazing. Maybe one word on the multilateralism or on the teaming up with China on climate change. I think there are many things that we should address together with China, be it climate change or even non-proliferation issues. But we have a total tension between the necessity to address certain things in a multilateral framework and the multilateral framework doesn't deliver. So I think the question is, how do we get those two things together? We all insist we need China on climate change, we need more, but the progress is really limited. And I think this is one of the challenges we have to overcome.
Bob, I want you to invite you to comment on any of these issues, but also just looking ahead, it seems to me that one of the major multilateral fora that's on the horizon that presents an opportunity for us to make progress both in our transatlantic kind of consensus building, but also in thinking about how we approach some of these global issues together is this Summit for Democracy that's coming up towards the end of the year. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how the administration could use that as an opportunity to sort of create some forward momentum on some of the issues we've been talking about.
I'm sorry, Michelle, who was that question for?
No, it's for you.
Oh, I have no idea. Not to be flippant, but I think the world looks to America and is trying to figure out our domestic politics, and they're trying to make judgments about the state of democracy in the United States of America. And whatever signals we can send to reassure the world that we're not going in reverse here, but are actually standing up for what we believe in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence is going to have so much more effect than a meeting of heads of state in Washington on this topic, where even the invitee list becomes so controversial. The media is so predictably going to be primed to draw contrast between the grand statements that may come out of a communique of meeting like this and sort of the reality of some of the pushback that's going on in various American states, that I don't even know how you get the message out, even if the thing is a success within its own terms. And then last, there's just the hard reality that a president's hours each day are limited, and you pick one issue to highlight, there's a zero-sum game. There's a price to be paid in terms of something else you're trying to get done. Well, remember the very end of the Clinton administration, where he had to choose between Middle East peace and North Korean nuclear capability, and chose Middle East peace and then didn't get it. And Madeleine Albright was sent to North Korea and didn't get it. And we ended up 0 for 2. So this one, I know it's a campaign commitment, and well, enough said. I'll stop there.
So we have 5 minutes left. I just want to do a lightning round for each of you. If you were to sort of make an appeal, like one or two things that you think, whether it's the Biden administration or NATO or European governments, like the most important thing to do in the next 6 months to try to right the apple cart and get us in a stronger position of collaboration and building consensus and rebuilding trust and moving forward again. Bruno?
Look, I'm old enough to remember the 90s and the debates we were having about US commitment and US interest versus European interest. I think that overall, there comes a time where you know what the most important thing you expect from your allies. And I would say that in terms of French expectation from the United States is about consistency. Consistency. I know it's difficult in a country where you have elections every 2 years, but I think that if you want your allies to have their own clarity of purpose vis-a-vis the alliance and the transatlantic relationship, consistency is the most important thing. That's a theme that came up earlier on in our discussion about, wanting to have better coordination with the allies on the Indo-Pacific, but then doing AUKUS behind the back of one of your most important allies in the region. Wanting to rejuvenate alliances, but at the same time, getting ready to maybe adopt a nuclear declaratory policy, which will send shivers to the spine of the Japanese and the Germans and the French. So these two examples are not about consistency. And, it's a simple message. Whatever the policy is, have a policy. That's one you hear regularly. And also, and that's not to say that the French are always consistent, by the way, but I would say that expect consistency is really the one thing I think allies can reasonably expect from the United States.
Great, thank you. Claudia, well, how would you answer that?
I think I would put 3 words, and I would probably look at Washington as much as I would look to Berlin and our new incoming coalition, and I would put that as a kind of homework for both. And that would be coordination, real coordination, and not just information. No unilateral action. And again, I'm looking to Berlin and Washington here. And what Bruno said, consistency and reliability. And you could probably apply that to all dossiers in the moment, be it Europe, be it Russia, be it the Indo-Pacific, be it nuclear policy. And again, I'm looking to both capitals, Berlin and Washington, to really think of consistency, reliability, no unilateral action, and coordination as key principles of how you interact with your allies. So more principles than topics, because those principles would apply to all topics.
Very good. Thank you. Bob, you have the last word.
Okay, well, 3 things. For the administration, do 2 things. First, ratify the Law of the Seas Treaty, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. It's incomprehensible to me that in this competition we're facing with China, that we don't have international law on our side by being a participant in a treaty that takes our side of the case. Second is rejoin the successor to TTIP. I can't believe we're leaving the field to China to join that treaty while we're still out, when the competition with China is going to be as much legal and economic as it's going to be military. And then on the military side, I would urge anyone who wants to be a defense minister in a European NATO ally or an EU member state to read this obscure report produced every 5 years that almost no one in the world knows about, called the Suitability and Risk Assessment Report from the 2 NATO strategic commanders. And what that report, we tried very hard to lay out for Europe what it would mean if the United States was not able to commit 100% of its forces in America and the Pacific to come to Europe's rescue in terms of the level of risk. We thought that would be a catalyst for more European capability, particularly with regard to strategic enablers like air refueling. But instead, the Europeans read this Suitability and Risk Assessment Report and said, well, we'll just take the greater risk. So there you are.
Well, Bob, I vote, you have my vote on all 3. So, but let me just say thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful speakers, Bruno, Claudia, Bob, and thanks to the Nunn School and Georgia Tech for hosting us. We look forward to continuing this conversation and others in the future. Thanks so much, and have a good day. Have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Great to see you, Michèle.